You are listening to the Reading for the Glory podcast. Join us as we have meaningful conversations that will help us discover truth, goodness, and beauty through the written word. For more information and additional resources, please visit readingfortheglory.com. This episode is brought to you by Beeson Divinity School. Beeson is an evangelical seminary at Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama, that offers a robust Master of Divinity program, forming students in person through a community-oriented model of theological education. Thanks to a generous gift, Beeson is now offering new full tuition scholarships for the 2025-2026 academic year, making its flagship MDiv program more affordable than ever. These full tuition scholarships cover the cost of tuition and fees for 3 years, which is the average time it takes to finish the MDiv program. These scholarships won't last long, so for more information and to apply, please visit beesondivinity.com or click the link in today's show notes. Welcome back to the Reading for the Glory podcast. I am your host, Zach Kendrick. I serve as the executive director here at Reading for the Glory, and we have another great conversation coming your way today. I'm excited to be joined by Dr. Jessica Hooten Wilson. Jessica is the Fletcher Jones Endowed Chair of Great Books at Pepperdine University, and she has written or edited numerous books, including The Scandal of Holiness, Giving the Devil His Due, and Reading for the Love of God. Jessica also speaks around the world on topics such as Russian novelists, Catholic thinkers, and Christian ways of reading. So welcome to the Reading for the Glory podcast, Jessica.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, today we're going to be having a discussion around Jessica's book, Reading for the Love of God. And I love the subtitle. It says, How to Read as a Spiritual Practice. So that's going to launch us into a broader discussion of reading and Christian ways of reading and the practice of reading for spiritual formation. But before we do that, I would like to invite our listeners, as we do each week, to consider becoming a ministry partner with us. One of the first ways you can do that is through prayer. No ministry can exist without prayer. And so we'd invite you to pray for the ministry of Reading for the Glory as we continue the work that the Lord is leading and calling us to do. We'd also invite you to support the ministry financially if you're able. And for anybody that can do that on a monthly basis, we would love to send you a free gift as a thank you for being a supporter of Reading for the Glory. So if you'd like more information about that, you can go to readingfortheglory.com/free gift. Well, Jessica, as we turn to the topic of our conversation today around your book, Reading for the Love of God, and a broader discussion on reading, I was intrigued by the title of your book, Reading for the Love of God, and how similar that is to Reading for the Glory, the name of our ministry. And so when I saw the book, I was hooked by that, and I brought it home and began reading it, and I just knew I had to have you on as a guest. So very thankful to have you on today as we have this discussion. And so the first question I want to start with, hopefully it's not too hard of a question, but what is your favorite book?
So I think it depends on what you mean by the word favorite. Is it the most influential book on me? Is it the book that I read the most often? Is it the book that changed me the most and was a catalyst, right? There's just so many books and the different roles that they've played in my life. I oftentimes say my number one would be The Brothers Karamazov. I think it's one of the greatest novels ever written, but maybe my other favorite, to use that language, would be something like Sigrid Undset's Kristin Lavransdatter, which is just as thick as The Brothers K, but it was profoundly influential, especially over the last 10, 15 years or so for me, because it's a epic spiritual struggle of a woman kind of fighting her will versus God's will. It's very Augustinian, and it's beautiful. It's like a womb to tomb epic for a woman. And that was written in the 1920s and was received the Nobel Prize in Literature, and just phenomenal work. So those are probably my two number one choices.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the book Brothers Karamazov. Based on reading your book and other places, I've seen the title come up in recent months. And so I actually picked up a copy of it to have on my to-do list. I'm actually in the middle of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, or as most people think, it's one big novel. So I'm halfway through that series. And so Brothers is going to be the next in the docket once I finish the Lord of the Rings. So I'm definitely looking forward to that. So I'm glad that you mentioned that book today.
Well, I have a YouTube series on both of them because I've taught both of them at the college and at the graduate level. And so I did a series during, back in the COVID days, I did a series of teaching both of those novels online.
Well, as we continue in our conversation about the broader scope of reading, especially in a Christian worldview and for spiritual formation, why do you think that reading good books is important for human flourishing?
So there has to be some reason that God creates the world through words and then creates us in his image as though words are part of the creative act and part of our reception of being. And then Jesus Christ calls himself the Word. And then for much of Judeo-Christian history, we're called people of the book. So there seems to be some indication in our very human nature, and you can dig into this more. I mean, I dig into it more in my book, but just those few signs should be showing us something about who we are. And I think we've forgotten so much of that. And when you start to read, you realize how much it forms who you are. It forms your character. So the words that we know become the words that we say. The images we read become the way that we see, right? The ethics and the morals that we take in, they become the strength of our character in how we practice in the interpretation that we live out, right? The way we live our lives is an interpretation of what we read. And so all of these things seem to be true. So how much are we suffering just kind of an emaciated existence when we remove such a fundamental part of who we are from the practice of our daily existence? And so for me, reading has always been that. It's been a habit. And I realized, especially through teaching for the last 20 odd years of teaching, how much my students have changed and grown and recognized this, how much my children, it's reading is so much a part of who they become, and how different my kids are sometimes from other children, because my kids are formed not by screens, but by reading, by things that have depth and permanency and soul formation abilities. So there's I definitely write on it quite a bit more extensively, but those are kind of maybe some teasers to why I think it's important.
I think that's excellent. And I love the fact that you bring up limiting screen time. I know in my own family, we have a 5-year-old, and we definitely try to limit her screen time. And what we do allow her to watch, we try for it to be educational in some manner, but we definitely do try to limit that. But we do live in a tech world, a screen-centric society, unfortunately. And that's just a part of our culture. And, there are people out there who they just don't like reading, whether it's because they just didn't grow up reading, or they did read when they were little and they just don't like it now because in their adult life. What would you say to someone who may not like to read but enjoys a good story through a well-made movie or a well-made TV series?
So it's not just about the story. So stories are part of it. And for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, it was about the stories we were telling. One of the problems with the current medium is that it conditions you to desire the new all the time. And therefore, you're really just succumbing to your current culture and not being able to see it from without. So when it comes to the stories that you're even being formed by, when you're being limited to the algorithms of Netflix or Apple TV or whatever it is, you're just getting the current trends. Like you're a very thin soul defined by a very thin medium. And most of those things are not substantial. Most of the stories that they're telling you are going to be saturated with the expectations and blindnesses of today's moment and of today's culture. They're not well versed in kind of the history of what makes us human. So when you look at something like Homer's Odyssey, yes, those were mostly oral tales and they were told to people, but they were told poetically, which already draws out the soul towards something higher than just screens or images that flash and pace and move. It was stories told over hundreds and hundreds of years and perfected in a community. So it wasn't limited to the blindness of one storyteller. It was told, yes, for entertainment, but also formation. So these were stories that by the time we get to the 3rd century in Plato, they're discussing the cons and pros of Homer and what does it do to a city to be formed by the stories of Homer, and should we have better poetry for the Republic that could do more than even Homer's stories can. And that's when we later build on that tradition and we see things like the epics of Milton and the epics of Dante and some of these other storytellers realizing like we need to go deeper into the Christian tradition. If we're forming people by story, what does it look like now that Christ has died and risen again? And so I think when it comes to the story, that is only one aspect of the experience, right? And do you want to be told by story or formed by stories that are ancient, that carry you outside of your moment so you don't just participate in the blindness of your own time? Do you want stories that are told in a poetic form that actually challenge and require and ask something bigger of you? Do you want to be told by stories that are just going to feed your pleasure and entertainment? The number of people who watch movies and then they can't remember what they saw, or they'll see an ad and be like, oh, I want to watch that. Oh, wait, I've already seen this. They don't even remember because it doesn't have a long-lasting influence. It's just like cotton candy. And I think the majority of the things that we're fed through streaming, I mean, even think of that word like stream. It's not made for an impression. It's made to carry you along according to its agenda for your own pleasure so that you don't even notice, right? You don't wrestle with many movies. You don't wrestle with as much of the things as you see on screen. But when it comes to text, that's a completely different entity that is not just about the screen or the story. There's more to it than that when it comes to reading books.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you bring up about modern culture shaping and changing even the stories that we tell, maybe through the book, or maybe it's a short story or something. I know recently we took our daughter to see the new Disney live action / CG animated movie Snow White, that's the first Disney movie ever in the 1930s. It's what launched the Disney studios and made Disney what it is today. It's a good movie from a standpoint of there's no bad language and there's no bad scenes in it. It was very safe to take a little girl or, other children. So I wouldn't knock it for that. But, when I was watching the movie, I was thinking critically through it because I knew there was some controversy over the movie. And one of the things that I took away from that movie was it did fundamentally change the story. Whether it be the Brothers Grimm or even the original 1937 Disney film, Snow White in this new movie becomes the hero of her own story. And that's just not the storyline of the original story and the original movie. And so it's very interesting that you bring that up. And I think that's a great point. Well, I love one of the first titles of a chapter in your book. It's one of the first ones. It's titled, Why Should We Read Anything But the Bible? There's a lot there, especially growing up in and living in a Christian subculture. There's a lot to unpack there. So would you be willing to unpack that question a little bit for us?
Yeah, it's an interesting question that I got quite often. So my book, The Scandal of Holiness, came out 2022, I think. And as I was touring with that book, the Q&A, this is the question that kept coming up, because Scandal of Holiness is all about 20th century novels and how to read them in order to become more like Jesus. I love the idea. I mean, I believe this to be true, that our imaginations are formative for our calling towards holiness. And so what does that look like in reading fiction? But the question I kept getting was, there's so little time in the world, so little time to read. Why should we read anything else? We should just be formed by the Bible. Now, there have been Christians throughout history who, for the last several hundred years, maybe that would have also been true, just being formed by the Bible. The difficulty is, the reality is the Bible itself is a collection of books, and all of the authors that are in it are drawing on other books to write the things that they're writing. So the images that they're coming up with, that God is actually drawing together through them, is based on their reading lives. So you have people like Paul, who read so many other things, that when he gets up there, Areopagus, like he is able to draw on all these other things that he read in order to speak to this group. And then that becomes part of our scripture. So the Bible itself is not solely just God breathed without any of human culture in it. It's actually a compilation of human culture. Even the creation of the Bible is from human culture. It's from all these people who had read all these other things that helped them select and discern what should be brought together to become the canon. And of course, this even changes in the Reformation in the 1500s, when once again, the question of what needs to be in this Bible changes again, and we go from 72 books to 66 books, right? So over the course of human history, we've always been trying to create things that help us move and know the Lord better, and that this process has not happened in a silo. It's the same reason that God becomes a human being who walks and moves with us, right? That alone points to the fact that things we do here matter, right? They're part of this process. This kingdom is happening here and now as well. And we can't silo ourselves off, and we never have been able to. So even the pretense of only reading the Bible doesn't actually make you only read the Bible.
I think that's a great point. And, one of the things I've thought about over the last couple of years is, yes, I deeply believe that the Bible is the Word of God, and it is profitable for teaching, for correction, for rebuking, and for training in righteousness, right? And so that belief and fundamental core is not changed. But it's interesting, just growing up thinking about the Bible, it could be easily conveyed that the Bible is just magically handed down from heaven into one big volume. But it is interesting to think about the Bible as a collection of stories, a collection of books, a collection of writings from different genres, different authors across time. And it's put together, yes, in one collection for our benefit, but the Bible itself is drawing on culture and it's drawing on other ways of thinking, and it puts it together for spiritual formation and for our benefit, so we can know who God is and grow in our faith. And yes, the Bible does tell one story from beginning to end, and it all correlates. But there's a lot in the Bible that's maybe difficult to understand because of the genre, and so we have to unpack that a little bit. So the Bible isn't necessarily as easy to read as a lot of people think. And so, yeah, I think that's interesting to think about the Bible as a collection of books and how it was shaped over time. But that leads to another question that I have regarding spiritual formation. So how can reading good literature, as you talk about, benefit our spiritual life and our spiritual formation?
Yeah. So all of us know as Christians that you are in this process of sanctification, right? That none of us are exactly like Jesus right now. We all hope that that's the journey that we're on, that we're going that direction, right? That he finds us as we are and he moves us back towards him. So if we're in this process of construction, what are the practices and the ways of being that are going to help us become something other than we currently are at this moment, right? What are those things? And part of it is going to be life experience. We know that. But what are some of those intentional things? Well, we know reading, we know praying, we know fasting, right? We know some of these spiritual practices. Well, then when it comes to the life of reading, right? If we read certain literature that shows us something new about what it means to be holy or good, what forgiveness can look like, right? If I'm a child, I think forgiveness means saying I'm sorry when someone told me to say I'm sorry. I couldn't even tell you most of the times when I was 5 what I was sorry for or why, right? And it was about the authority telling you that. Well, as we get older, we realize, like, when do I need to say sorry? How do I say sorry? Like, and you look at these books in which I'm thinking of novels right now where people forgive. I was thinking of The Sunflower, where people forgive those who persecuted them in the Holocaust. Oh, that's a totally different level of forgiveness than I'm capable of, right? Or The Diary of a Country Priest, where this priest is talking to this mother and she finds out through this conversation with him, she realizes that she hasn't forgiven God for taking away her 2-year-old boy who died. And she's been holding on to it for 20 something years, right? And it's only through this fiery conversation that they have that she actually lets go and says, "Our Father," for the first time, right? So what does forgiveness look like? How do we practice it? When do we forgive? What happens if we don't forgive? All of these things we just can't figure out with just our own life. It's too short, it's too small, it's too limited. And books find a way to give us more of that, right? If Christ is so big and all encompassing and so far above us, then we need things to help bring us above ourselves. We need things that remind us how far the truth is beyond us, how far beauty is above us. These experiences like then draw us out and draw us higher. And if not, we're going to remain limited. As C.S. Lewis said, we're going to remain in the prison of our own selves.
I think that's very helpful. And, in my own life, growing up, I wasn't a reader early in life. I became more of a reader late in high school and especially into college and as I became an adult. But I gravitated towards nonfiction. I was highly interested in theology and the Christian living genres. And so I would read those types of books, history, biography. I loved those genres, and I would read more in the just in general nonfiction. And I really just didn't like fiction. I know, as I mentioned earlier, how I'm reading through the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I tried to read it several years ago, and I just couldn't. I didn't understand it. I didn't know what was going on. I was confused, and I just didn't get it. And it wasn't until my conversion to the broadly Catholic tradition, especially through the tradition of Anglicanism, that I discovered the transcendentals of truth, goodness, and beauty, and that massively reshaped my worldview. And I was able to see things differently and to see things in things like art and literature and music that I didn't see before. And so when I picked up again the Lord of the Rings trilogy, I was able to get past the sections that I wasn't able to understand before, and I saw things in it that I just never saw. And so it's been a good journey for me. But as you think about reading and not just as a spiritual practice, but just gleaning for wisdom and for life. You talk about reading fiction or classical literature. And some people may just not gravitate towards that genre. So do we have to read only good fiction or classic literature to experience a greater beauty and the grandeur of things that you discuss? Or can we get this sort of thing from maybe biography or history and other nonfiction works?
So, and it doesn't have to be classic. So, I mean, Scandal of Holiness, I only deal with 20th century. Like I deal with as close to this time period as possible. I don't know how much contemporary, like 21st century stuff I had in there. I can't remember now, but a lot of it was just 20th century for limitation. But just to show people that it's not just classics, like it's not just old books, but in some ways, those distance is really needed. So C.S. Lewis says for every new book you read, you should read 3 old books. Because the difficulty is a lot of times we are wasting time spinning our wheels about impermanent things. Most of the media and most of the culture is trying, and from my perspective, it's satanic, but it's trying to keep us focused on impermanent things so that we don't actually do anything. And so you get really fired up and you feel like you're doing something because you're paying attention to a lot of contemporary problems that shift and change every single day. Really, the only way I feel like to constantly be doing some good in the world is if your feet are fully grounded in permanency and you can see things with a broader vision, right? Prophets, the reason they're able to see the future is because they're so well grounded in the past, right? So the prophets knew the promises of God from the beginning of the Torah. And then they can speak prophetically because they are so grounded in it. They can see what's happening within a whole of human history that allows them to see the distant things nearby. And a lot of our great fiction writers did the same kind of thing. So you think of people like Flannery O'Connor. So when she was contemporary, she's so well versed in the past that she can speak all the way up to us 2025. And I think she will still be speaking 20 years from now. So for me, it's not just about literature or classics or things like that, but it are things that are prophetic, and there's just not a lot of text that do that as well as literature does. It's not only literature. I do think that there are some ways that history and philosophy and some of these other great books do that. My title is Great Books. I actually teach as much philosophy, theology, and history as I do literature, but it's the permanent text. So, I teach Kant, I teach Nietzsche, I teach Wollstonecraft, I teach Frederick Douglass, I teach W.E. Du Bois, I teach Anna Akhmatova. Like I teach across the whole breadth of the globe and across time and space, so that, like C.S. Lewis says, I see with myriad eyes, yet it is still I who sees. So I do think that we need books to be able to do this. I don't know that there's a lot of other mediums that do it as well. Most other mediums are just transfers of information, and they're not about spiritual formation. Those are drastically different things.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, that's part of the work that we're trying to do here at Reading for the Glory is to not push content or, the transmission of merely information, but to encourage and to equip and to point people to good resources that will help people in their own spiritual formation. And so when we think about reading that way, we can read anything and benefit from it spiritually. That is one of the ancient practices of Lectio Divina. or divine reading. And so not necessarily just reading the Bible or other sacred texts, but reading anything and gleaning from it a divine meaning, because all truth is God's truth, all goodness is God's goodness, and all beauty is God's beauty. But for listeners who might kind of push back on that and think that we can only grow spiritually by reading the Bible, how can we read something spiritually if we don't consider it sacred?
So they're exactly right. There's two different, I love Kierkegaard's essay on the two different practices of writers. You're either an apostle or a genius, and apostles have apostolic authority, right? Given by God. Geniuses have a gift from God by which they make us aware of the truths of the apostles. So there's just two different kinds of writers, right? Kierkegaard, again, he was a genius. So he knew how to distinguish between geniuses and apostles. And so I think there's a lot of things that we're going to read spiritually by geniuses that are not authoritative in every word. So for example, if you are reading a letter by St. Paul, you get to walk through that and dissect all the words, and they have authority, and you don't get to choose which ones you want to keep and which ones you don't. When you read something by Dostoevsky, you keep all the things that correlate with the Bible. You keep all the stuff that matches what you know to be true. And because you're so well formed by the Bible and your Bible reading, you can see those things, right? And they can teach you. So when Dostoevsky talks about love and the necessity of loving people, and that love can't be, in his words, immediate or desiring for immediate gratification, it has to be a practice, and it requires courage, and it requires constancy, right? Well, we can see that that's also true in scripture. So when he describes love that way, that matches what we understand. When he is anti-Semitic and talks about, Jews being burned, and this is in the Grand Inquisitor and stuff, and these heretics that were burning alive, and so, anti-Semitism is not true. There's nothing in the Bible that says that we should be against Jews, because in fact, the King of all kings is Jewish, right? Right. So we can see that is a clear difference between the two. But this also allows us to not succumb to the current trend of canceling and censoring, right? I'm not going to throw out Shakespeare because he's misogynist. I'm going to say, okay, there's a lot about Taming of the Shrew that doesn't match my understanding of what women are and what we should be and the freedom we should have. But at the same time, look at some of these poetic lines, right? The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon a place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesses him that gives and him that takes. Man, that's true. I see that in the Gospels about mercy and understanding. So we can only be discerning kind of back and forth in this reciprocal relationship between the Bible has formed me, and I've digested it so much within, and I continue to read it, that it is the lens by which I see. It has that level of authority. But then I can then spiritually read these other things that help me understand more fully what the Bible means. And it's a back and forth. It's a relationship between the things that are written by geniuses and the things that are written by the apostles.
Yeah, I find that very helpful. And that leads to something else you brought up in your book about reading in a Trinitarian nature. You use the acronym ART, or the art of reading, and how we can read in light of the Trinity because God is triune. And so we relate to him in a triune nature. And when we experience things in the world, we can experience it in a triune lens. And so how can we read books and literature using a Trinitarian lens?
So I taught a graduate course that I called The Art of Reading, without realizing that as calling it the art of reading, that it also mapped itself onto the author, reader, and text Trinitarian way of reading that I was talking about, which is ART. So now every time I talk about the art of reading, I'm like, of course it's author, reader, and text. But Aristotle, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, was talking about every single communicative moment, so rhetorical moment, was in a triangle of pieces. You always have the author and the reader, or the audience, right? And the text itself, the message or communication. And so every reading experience also takes this into account. And the more that I started looking at this and recognizing it matched so much onto the Trinity, God as the author, the text being the Logos, being Jesus Christ, and the reader being the receptive Holy Spirit. And in each one of us, then, when we are reading and engaging his text, right, we're getting to hear from the author through the book, which is the Word, which is also Christ himself. And then we are also participating in the life of Christ the more that this book is forming us and we as readers are receiving it. And so we in ourselves become a small triangle. The Bible itself is a triangle. And then, of course, everything we're reading, we're then taking that experience too. So it's this giant, in Trinitarian theology, they talk about perichoresis, the relationship between the three persons and the one substance. And this is kind of what the reading experience always is this dance between us playing authors, us playing readers, us playing with the text in front of us, and even our own lives when we go out and live our interpretations, we are then the authors of that interpretation, and other people are interpreting our lives as a piece of text, right? We are the walking witnesses. We are supposed to be his image, his walking image before them. And so there's this constant relationship that I think we need to keep in mind when we imagine what it means to read Trinitarianly.
So these next few questions towards the end of our conversation today come from your book directly. I took the questions directly from your book. You have a FAQ section at the end. And so I wanted to ask you a few of these because I thought they were very well put, and the topics that they bring up are very interesting. And so for readers, you can go to the book and go to the FAQ section. You do have a couple of paragraphs or a paragraph or so on each of these questions, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to expound on them here in this conversation. And so, we talk about reading and we talk about books and reading in a spiritual lens and how that can be useful for spiritual formation. But how can we know whether a book is a good book?
I hear that quite a bit. I think, we can start with the transcendentals, truth, goodness, and beauty. I mean, that's kind of one of the easiest ways to start thinking about a text. Does it tell the truth about the world? And like I said, from my perspective, the truth is, yes, what we find in scripture to be true, but also the book of nature. So the medievals always thought of the world around us as the book of nature. Right. There's also the idea that each of us is a book being written by God. Right. This is the Psalms, so we too are books. And so there's a sense in which we judge all books by these three books, the book of our own experience, the book of scripture, and the book of nature. And if these things are telling the truth about the world, right, we're going to recognize it through those three books because it matches all the other books that we've read, those three books meaning. So I think truth is part of it. I think goodness. Now, this does not mean that all characters are good. But like you mentioned with Snow White, is it uplifting the good as the good? So showcasing evil as evil still makes a book good. Flannery O'Connor is one of the key examples of this, or Dostoevsky, in which evil is evil. The evil is not uplifted as good, even if you've dug into the darkness and shown the evil. The problem comes from things like, I hate to say this, maybe Percy Jackson's a good example. I love the Percy Jackson books. The Percy Jackson, the first set of movies that came out, they uplifted things like rebellion and lying and deception as the good hero character, and that he was doing the right thing. None of that is true, and none of that is in the book. That is uplifting evil as goodness, and then it's, again, not telling the truth either, right? So it's both not telling what goodness is and not telling the truth. So you have to know the difference. So a lot of Christians are scared to read about evil things, but if the evil is being presented as evil, you're pretty much on safe grounds. And then when it comes to beauty, now this we have to cultivate a taste for, because most of our taste has been cultivated by advertising. And so we only like what culture tells us to like because it's trying to get us to buy it. And so it's the god of mammon who's controlling our taste for what is beautiful. And in order to get out of that idea of what is beautiful, we have to go kind of back in time, but also think about what we're made for. If we're made for contemplation, so we're going to worship God forever, then we're made for something eternal and lasting, which is why we should go back and be formed by timeless things, right? So we can see what's lasted, so we can see what's going to maybe last longer, and these will give us hints and indications for how we should be formed. So when we look at something and don't find it beautiful, but for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years around the world, they've thought it was beautiful, other people, it's an indication that maybe we have poorly formed taste, right? Because something has lasted a lot longer than we're going to last in this body, and therefore maybe we should submit to it, right? And think through it. The other part is how we're made. We're also made to contemplate, which is a slow, attentive self-forgettingness. If a piece of art calls us to that, if we sit in front of it longer, if we wait, if we pay attention, and then we begin to see more clearly, then there's probably some beauty there. If we look at something and we sit in front of it, Mako Fujimura says 20 minutes. If we sit in front of something for 20 minutes and nothing is revealed, it may have nothing to reveal, you know? But I think we need to be understanding what is good by those practices of seeking, like we've said before, the truth and the goodness and the beauty. Those are kind of our first rubric to go to.
Yeah, I think that is a very good point. And, we live in a very fast paced culture that is busy. And especially for people who have families and children, things are always moving parts. And so there's very little time, it seems like, to read or even to just do things that you enjoy sometimes because the schedule is packed and we have limited time. So for people who may experience that busyness of life, but they still want to read, they still want to get into reading some good books. How can we find ways to read more?
I think we have to make time. This is part of an obligation or a duty, and we don't actually do it. You were talking about screens. So in our house, for example, the screen is not in an easily accessible room. So if we're going to have family night, movie night, we all go there and watch it, but it's not something that people could turn on and still be a part of what's going on in the world because we just don't have it. It's not in our kitchen. It's not in our bedroom. It's not in the main of the living room. And so we just don't make screens the priority. If you're in a room, most of those rooms have books in them in my house. And so you can more easily access books. So that's how my kids can spend their times because before they go to bed, guess what's next to their bed? It's not an iPad, it's a book. Or, when we're sitting on the couch, what's more accessible, the TV or a book? Well, it's actually a book, right? So keeping the books around is a priority. People always ask how I have time to read. I read on the plane. Everyone around me is watching something on the plane. There's very few movies that I think that would be worth spending my time watching. I recently watched Conclave. I thought that was worth my time, but there's very few movies that are like, this is worth it. And instead, I'd rather just sit there on the plane and get to read, and it's time and it's quiet, and we're just misusing it. I hate walking up and down those planes and just seeing them filled with people watching stuff, right? Having a book in your car. I keep a book in my car. I keep a book in my bag. So I think part of it is just making it a life in which you have the book around all the time and it's constantly accessible. Way too many people turn on their screens. The best books on this, like to get away from your screens, Andy Crouch, The Life That We Want or something like that. I can't remember what it's called, The Life We Want to Have. Or his smaller help book, which is like The Tech Wise Family. I mean, he has a bunch of advice for how to do this. So for example, my husband has control over the passwords on my phone. I can't access social media on my phone. I spend probably an hour to an hour and a half max. My phone tells me I spend an hour to hour and a half. And now that it's summer and I don't even have to answer emails this summer on my phone, it'll probably be less than an hour on my phone every day. Right. So I think that that's key. Keeping those temptations away from you, you're just not going to miss out. You're going to find that you're just really not going to miss the screen and you're going to feel free from it. I mean, you just will. I think Jonathan Haidt writes on this a lot, but the most detrimental thing we're doing is mistraining our youth to have screens when none of them from the time they were little ever thought of screens. We're the ones who gave it to them. We're the ones that invited them into our bad habits. And if we cut it off now, we're going to invite them into better habits. They're going to be more grateful when they're 35 and look back and be like, praise the Lord, my parents didn't give me screens all the time and they gave me books. I don't know what I would have done if they were constantly giving me screens. I'd probably be trapped even now, right, in screens. And so we have to think about who we want our kids to be when they're older and what we want them to be able to look back on their lives and say, because they may not be grateful to us now at 14, but they're going to be grateful for us at 35. And so we need to think about that person and how we're helping that person through discovering the good of reading.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, what is your opinion of reading on a tablet or on a phone? I know for myself, maybe I'm at a doctor's office or waiting on an appointment somewhere else, and I have a few minutes while I'm in the waiting room or waiting to be called back for something. And I have the Kindle app on my phone, and when I have a few minutes in those kind of moments, I pull out my phone and maybe read on it for that few minutes. So what would your opinion be on reading on a tablet or a phone?
So The problem is it's twofold. I'm not completely against it. I think there's a utility to it. And I do think that that's the way that things are moving. I do not assign anything or allow any Kindles in my classroom. And when I have the conversation with students, I talk to them about what books are and how they approach books. So for example, if I pulled a book off my shelf right now, this is Czesław Miłosz, right? Native Realm. The very feel of the book, the very size of the book, being able to find your place in the book, the interaction with the book is like, this was by Miłosz. This is somebody else besides Miłosz. It carries you back to that community-centered idea when you're reading, rather than everything on the screen becomes a matter of your own consumption. And if you're reading on the Kindle all the time, can I remember, did I read that in Miłosz? Did I read that in Lewis? Did I read that in Colin? Like, who was that? It all looked the same, and it was all on the screens, and I can't remember the feel or the place of the book or whose words those were, right? It kind of actually removes us from being able to really remember and take these things in. So that's part of it. I think the other is distraction. I mean, the number of times I've tried to read on my Kindle and then I think of an email I need to send. And because it's easily accessible, I move from the Kindle app into my Gmail app. And it's like, oh, and then I get mad at myself because I'm like, no, I only have 10 minutes to read right now. I want to read. But because I'm reading it on my phone, I'm more easily distracted to go do something else with my phone. The possibilities are endless, and my mind will take me there. So I think we have to actually have just a better practice of turning off our phone and opening up the book.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. And to follow up on that as well, thinking about reading on a screen, what would your thoughts be on listening to books in an audiobook form?
Yeah, absolutely. In my reading for the love of God, I talk about the twofold process of reading, the scholastic and the monastic. And this isn't from me. This is Jean Leclerc, something about love and desire of God. I remember titles poorly too, but so when John Leclerc is talking about the monastic versus scholastic discipline, monastic is when you love the text for what it is, and then the scholastic is when you study it. It's hard to study something on Audible. But for the monastic experience, you can just listen. So for example, my husband's listening to the Brothers Karamazov, or he listened to the Odyssey, or, listening to books is, to me, just as good for the monastic experience of just enjoying what you're listening to. So I listen to quite a few books. Most of the time I end up loving a book like Win Collier's biography of Eugene Peterson, Burning in My Bones. I listened to it on Audible, and then I was like, I have to have this in my hand because I'm going to write a review of this because it's that good, that I want the scholastic discipline of loving it a second time, right? Page by page, underlining it, marking it. But those are two different practices and two different ways of reading. And not every book demands a scholastic approach, right? So you can just actually do quite a few monastically through Audible.
Yeah, I think those are very helpful pieces of advice. And yeah, I mean, we live in a fast-paced world and technology is all around us. And so I think we can use technology to our advantage. But I do agree that it's better to pick up the physical book. I always try to pick up the physical copy of a book and read it before I purchase an audio or ebook. But just sometimes, it's easier and cheaper sometimes to get the ebook. And so, I think that's helpful advice. So, two more questions for you before we go. And I'm really fascinated by this question, and I'm interested to hear what you have to say about it. But you ask in the FAQs, why do Catholics have all the good literature? And I find that interesting because I would also add C.S. Lewis, who was an Anglican, and Malcolm Guite to that discussion as well. But why do Catholics seem to have all the good literature?
Yeah, well, I think the Catholics stopped being, in the 1500s, not to throw everything at the Protestant Reformation, but in the 1500s, the Reformation threw away a lot of things and became very afraid of a lot of things.
Yes.
And, the original practice of reforming the church because of exploitation and misuse of mammon and indulgences and things like that were all good, right? So Luther had a point. You read 95 theses and you're like, yep, you have a really good point here. But then all the other stuff that kind of gets lost, what Brad Gregory calls the unintended reformations that happen, where you lose the four senses of reading, which I talk about in Reading for the Love of God, right? That's a Catholic practice in which you can read almost anything as it's literal, and then spiritually, and then read it morally for how you're going to live, and then read it towards how it's helping you die or point you towards the prophetic or point towards the afterlife. These are reading practices that get lost. The idea that all art, right, could be good. Well, if you're Calvin, it cannot, because some are saved and some are damned. And there's a lot of images that could come from those who are damned who could lead you astray. And so images become very questionable. Art becomes questionable. Whereas the Catholic, all truth is God's truth, very Augustinian. Therefore, even the most heinous person can create something beautiful because God created them, right? And so they
So
have the
true.
capacity within them to create something beautiful. So there's lots of things that happen theologically in the Protestant Reformation that I think more and more of us who are Protestant, I'm Protestant, are recognizing we lost. And it doesn't mean you have to become Catholic. All my Catholic friends are like, yes, it does. But no, it doesn't. It doesn't mean you have to become Catholic. But it does mean that there's a lot of things that weren't necessary to throw out. And you don't have to become Catholic to reclaim these things that belong to the whole universal small c Catholic Church.
Well, as we wrap up our time today, the last question I have, try to ask this to guests who are writers and authors, is do you have any current or future writing projects in the works?
Yes. So for the last 5 or 6 years, I've been working on a book on women. And my friend, speaking of Catholics, Dana Joya, he gave me the title, so I have to give him full credit. But I was telling him about this problem that I've been seeing in which feminists talk about becoming like a man in order to be the most empowered woman, which seems so problematic to me, right? Kind of throws out motherhood. It throws, you have to become more aggressive. You have to become, all these false identifiers of what men are even in order to become the best woman. And then on the other side, within the church, more and more, it's becoming this idea of reclaiming womanhood that is very reductionistic. And women are made for men and know God in him. And this is, to me, also a false interpretation of scripture that you don't have to go back to, but they're both responding to each other poorly. And it's becoming a greater and greater divide between the two. And Dana said, yeah, women have always had to be twice rebels, rebelling against both of those reductions of who they are to showcase the fullness of who they are. And the more that I investigated this kind of twice rebellion and where it happened, I realized it happened at the turn of the 20th century. In which Christian feminist movement, they got rid of the white slave trade laws, and the Christian feminists also kind of went into brothels and were helping people. They started fighting for suffrage. They fought against alcoholism with the temperance movement. They were great abolitionists. There were all these things that the early Christian feminists were doing, and then later feminism moved away from. And so these amazing Christian women were not wanted by that feminist movement, but then they were also not wanted by the church because they were saying women should preach and women can teach and women should be educated and go to college and women should, so that's the women I'm currently writing on in this book called Twice Rebels. So it's Kate Bushnell and Dorothy L. Sayers and Julia Cooper, Edith Stein, Maria Skovitsova, and Agnes Maud Royden, which some of these names are familiar and some of them aren't. And kind of this book is reclaiming their stories to show women a way of being a woman.
Well, thanks again, Jessica, for joining us today on the Reading for the Glory podcast to talk about your book, Reading for the Love of God. I know I certainly benefited from our conversation greatly, and I hope our listeners did as well. We'll definitely have to have you back on soon.
Appreciate it. Well, thanks so much. Blessings.
We'll be sure to have a link to your book in today's show notes so our listeners can have a way to pick that up. And for our listeners, if you have a comment, a question, or would simply like to drop us a note, you can do that in the comment section below. We'd also encourage you to check us out on social media. We're on Facebook, X, Instagram, and Threads. You can also be sure to check us out on YouTube. Be sure to also check out our website at readingfortheglory.com to stay up to date on our latest articles, book reviews, and podcasts. And if you would like to contact us via email, you can do that at readingfortheglory.com/contact. We'd also encourage you to subscribe and to leave us a review wherever you're listening to this podcast. That is very helpful for us. And we look forward to having you join us again next time on the Reading for the Glory podcast as we discover truth, goodness, and beauty through the written word.